or evening.
It's evening in China. Nice to see you.
Nice to meet you.
Here. It's CJ here.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Luohan Webinar. It's CJ from Luohan Academy. And today we are very happy to have Professor David Autor from MIT to talk about the new frontiers, the origins and content of new work using the data from 1940 to year 2018, which is very fascinating. The Professor Autor is the fourth professor in the MIT Department of Economics, and he's also the Distinguished Fellow of the Luohan Academy, co-director of NBER Labor Studies Program, and co-leader of both MIT Work for Future Task Force and JPAL Work for Future Experimental Initiative. So in his research, Professor Autor studied the labor market impact of technical change and globalization on job polarization, skill demand, earning levels and inequality, and also the electoral outcomes. And Professor Autor has received many prestigious prizes, including the Alfred Sloan Research Fellowship and also the National Science Foundation Career Award. So without further ado, Professor Autor, please take it over. The floor is yours. You will have 90 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be a fellow of the Luohan Academy. Feel free at any point to ask questions as I speak. I really appreciate the questions. They're very helpful to me and they make it more interesting and engaging for everyone. So don't hesitate. This is a joint work with Anna Salomons of Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and I'm Brian Segmeller, who's a PhD student at the MIT Sloan School. And here we're trying to understand the relationship between technological change and both the replacement of existing work and the creation of new work. And the creation of new work, I think, is the contribution we're really focused on here. So to get started, the sort of a question I think in many people's minds, certainly in my mind, is whether automation is eroding human comparative advantage. And so I quote from the recent book by the economist Daniel Susskind, machines will not do everything in the future, but they will do more. And as they slowly but relentlessly take on more and more tasks, human beings will be forced to retreat to an ever-shrinking set of activities. So let me say this is an argument with a prestigious intellectual pedigree. Vasily Leontief made the same or similar argument in 1983, actually also talking about robots and said progressive introduction of new computerized, automated, and robotized equipment can be expected to reduce the role of labor, similar to the process by which the introduction of tractors and other machinery first reduced and then completely eliminated horses and other draft animals. So remember he was writing nearly 40 years ago and talking about computers and robotics. And so this is not the sort of simplistic lump of labor idea that there's only so much work to be done. And so if machines do more, people do less. It's just it's an argument about comparative advantage. And it's quite possible that these tasks would need to be done, and yet humans would not be competitive in doing them if the cost of the shadow cost of labor can only fall so low. People need to eat, they need housing, so you have to be able to pay them. And horses are a good example of a technology that's just no longer competitive to supply the tasks that can now be supplied by machinery. So there's a lot, there's kind of a body of what people call task models that you could sort of think of as formalizing Leontief's idea, which is that machines have expanding comparative advantage in a range of tasks that need to be accomplished to do work. And as their capacities increase, they displace labor from a set of tasks. Now, that doesn't mean that actually that labor is necessarily immiserated, because there are actually two countervailing effects. One is task displacement, which would reduce labor's share of output. The other, of course, is the complementarity that comes from accomplishing a subset of tasks more efficiently. And that, of course, raises total output. So even if labor's share is falling, labor's total payments could rise. So it's unclear in that set of models. But there's a lot of evidence to support that this is onto something. We see a striking substitution of computers and robotics for directly affected occupations and industries. And the number of examples of papers documenting that is now too long to list. So there's no question that we do see automation encroaching on human tasks in certain domains. And so certainly part of this notion is confirmed. But what is sort of missing from that potentially missing from that class of models and has been recognized for a while is that the set of tasks may not be fixed, that over time, new tasks might emerge. And so even if we are automating some subset of tasks, we might be simultaneously creating new ones that are labor using. And so this is first, kind of demonstrated empirically by in a paper by Jeff Lynn in 2011, where he attempts to measure the emergence of new work between 1970 and 2000 using a variety of US historical documents. And we're going to build on his work here. So we're going to use his approach and then add to it. This idea of new work is then formally brought into the task model in a series of papers by Acemoglu and Restrepo. And they and you can think of sort of machinery, automation eroding human comparative advantage, and automation, and new task creation is basically reinstating human comparative advantage. So these are kind of countervailing forces, one eliminating, one automating tasks, the other creating new tasks. And then in their papers, they kind of develop a set of proxies for new work, which is just changes in industry labor shares. They view that as automation, or old occupations emerging in new industries. They view that as new work creation. But really, we know very little about this phenomenon. We have some related evidence on task change within occupations, a series of papers, one using the hand and machine labor study from 1899 that looks at what happens when the making of shoes goes from artisanal to assembly line. We have data from historical job advertisements, data looking at recent job advertisements from Burning Glass, but really not much evidence on where's new work, what is new work, how much of it is there, where does it come from, what does it contain? And so the contributions of this paper are, one is to consistently measure the task content of new work over 8 decades. And here we build on Lynn. Second, we want to explore its technological and economic origins. By technological, I mean its relationship to innovation. By economic, I mean its relationship to incentives. And then we want to analyze its relationship to employment and wages. So that's the objective we set for ourselves. And let me kind of motivate this a little bit. This shows you
David?
Yes, please go ahead.
Sorry, can I ask one question regarding the direction of technical change? So obviously, this kind of two forces is going to depend on the direction of technical change, right? Because R&D worker is going to really push
absolutely
the frontier of the technical frontier, and they're going to determine which type of new task they want to substitute or become a complement, or
That's correct. Yeah. So for much of what we're doing here, we're sort of taking let me qualify. So for part of the analysis, we're going to take the direction of technological change as given, and we're going to say, look at the relationship between innovation and the emergence of new tasks, the automation of other old tasks. We're also going to look directly at the response of the emergence of new work to different demand forces. And so you can think of that as induced new work creation at potentially working through the direction of technological change. We're not going to, and I'll come back. So it's an excellent question. We can come back to it because there's one link that we're not going to explore today, which is the direct link between patents and these demand forces. But we are going to look at the relationship between demand forces and the creation of new work. So it's a really it's an important question. So to motivate this further, this shows this is the occupational distribution of US employment in 1940. There's about 45 million workers in that period. And these are organized into 12 occupations that encompass all work, and they're ordered from lowest paying to highest paying, roughly. So you can see most of employment in this period was in agriculture and in production. That encompasses more than 30% of all work. Now roll the clock forward to 2018, and you can see a number of things. First of all, the number of workers has roughly tripled, so it's about 150 million. Second, there's a decline in absolute terms, both in agriculture and in production work, despite the tripling of the size of the labor force, and enormous growth in managerial, professional, clerical, and in some degree to personal service occupations as well. Now, the green and the red bars further break this down into work in occupational titles that existed in 1940, which is the green, and work in occupational titles that are new since 1940, over in the intervening 80 years. And what you can see is that about 2/3 of all of employment in 2018 is found in job types that have been added since 1940. So a lot, and of course, a lot of the most rapidly growing occupations are ones where the most new work exists. Now I'm going to define what I mean by new work in a moment, and this is an approximation for reasons that will become clear. But it suggests that potentially understanding where this is coming from is quite important. And so what we're going to do in this paper is really there are three things. One is that we hypothesize where new task creation and task displacement are that they're linked to three forces. The first is technologies that complement the outputs of occupations. We're going to call that augmentation. The other is that technologies that substitute for the inputs of occupations. We're going to call that automation. And then the third is demand shifts that create incentives for both of those things to occur. We're going to measure the emergence of new work in this period and document its evolution and measure the technologies that augment versus automate occupations. And that's kind of a key kind of objective of the paper that we think we have had some success with. So, and then we're going to test empirically, first of all, whether augmentation automation affect new task creation, as do demand shifts. And second, whether they have distinct effects on employment and potentially on earnings as well. So that's the way we're going to proceed. Okay, so there's a kind of well, you haven't seen the paper because we haven't finished the paper. We're still a week away from releasing it. So let me see if I can very briefly describe the conceptual framework that underlies it. So this is a model with two sectors, a skills intensive and an unskill intensive sector. Each sector and those things are just combined Cobb-Douglas in final consumption, right? And then within each sector, there's a production function that's a CS aggregate of tasks. So J refers to either S or U, skill or unskill intensive. And those tasks are on an unit interval from NJ-1 to NJ. And they're combined CS, and this sigma is going to be greater than 1. These tasks are gross complements. Within each sector, you can think of these tasks arranged on this unit interval from NJ-1 to NJ. And there's this point IJ, which is the automation frontier. So all tasks on this interval can be performed by labor, but in tasks NJ-1 to IJ, automation has comparative advantage, capital has comparative advantage. So these tasks will be done by machinery. Then what can happen is you can have two different things occurring. This builds on Asimov and Restrepo, I should say, 2018 AER paper. On the one hand, you can have automation, which basically increments IJ and reallocates tasks from capital labor. This has two effects. One is, of course, it reduces labor share. On the other hand, it also raises the output of that sector, right? So those have basically countervailing substitution and scale effects. The substitution effect is clearly negative for labor. The scale effect is positive. The net effect is ambiguous. Or you can have forces that increment NJ. Those create new tasks. Those reinstate labor share. And those have complementary substitution and scale effects because it increases demand for labor directly within tasks and then increases output because it's productivity enhancing. And then you have labor that flows between those sectors. So one, we asked directly what happens when these things change, and you can demonstrate that they increase sector size and they have intuitive effects on labor demand. Then additionally, we model changes in demand for these sectors. So if you have an increase, for example, in demand for the U-intensive, the unskill intensive sector, that will cause increases in both IJ and NJ. Both of those margins will move, but at least as the model is written, this margin will move faster. And so the result is a demand shift will cause both automation and new task creation in the sector in which it is occurring. And that will augment demand for labor. And if that's the unskill intensive sector, that will raise the wage of unskilled labor because this sector is more intensive. If it's the skilled sector, it will raise the wage of skilled labor relative to unskilled labor. So it matters which sector the demand shift occurs in. is going to affect where the innovation automation occurs and ultimately how the shape of labor demand changes. So that's kind of a summary of the model, and I realize that's a lot, but we're going to look at these, the two pieces of this that we're going to look at is one, we're going to look at the relationship between things that automate and augment and how they how they're related to new work creation as we measure it, and how they're related to the emergence of new titles. And then we're going to look at how these things respond to demand shifts. And finally, we're going to relate changes in these indices to changes in employment within occupations.
Hi, David. I want to ask a question regarding this framework.
Yes.
So here, so the difference between task and like a capital, intermediate good, labor, not that different. It looks like so those it's also like an intermediate good, right? It's like a service. It's some intermediate good closer to the final output VS and value. But now it's like we have 4 layers. So entrepreneurs L and H, the first layer. So that's the kind of probably more homogeneous, generative more homogeneous input, capital, intermediate Q, and the labor N. So those are more homogeneous. And then go to the next layer of intermediate goods, which you call them tasks. Actually, this kind of a variety of intermediate goods that will combine to generate the final good VS and value. So conceptually, to me, it seems like the task is just add another layer of intermediate good. Is this understanding correct or appropriate?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, basically, you know, you can think of tasks as I mean, that's right. They're really just inputs, right? So capital and labor are both inputs in the production function. It's just in the task component, that is a kind of a space where capital and labor can both supply the services that are required. And so what this model allows you to do is to have, substitution within that piece of the production function. But yes, they all ultimately aggregate up into final goods. So what the task thing does is just allow you to model the interplay between capital and labor, or between automation and labor supply and new task creation in a flexible way that doesn't impose a constant elasticity of substitution. Effectively, by allowing that margin to move, it has a very different direct effect on labor demand than allowing for a simple a change in the elasticity or a normal demand shift. I don't know if that clarifies the question.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't turn on my camera. So, thank you. Yeah. So that's so I have a follow-up question. So maybe those concepts might be dynamic. So I mean, so in the later, so at the time develops, maybe those tasks also can become more standard. Maybe they can become a lower level than at the line that they can be outsourced to other people that might become something similar to labor, right? More homogeneous. So I mean, this maybe this concept is dynamic. Something now we call it a task. Later on, maybe it could become some homogeneous. It's coming in the same level as the capital, labor, and the intermediate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way of seeing it. So you could sort of think of this process of this I incrementing as it might be machinery, or it might simply be that we've sort of learned to do this task in a very routine codifiable way, right? So most you say, well, why are even new tasks? Why even assume that they're labor using, right? Why aren't all new tasks just capital using? And I think part of the intuitive answer is, normally the first time when you begin doing something, you don't have the routine down. And so it requires expertise. It requires, specific artisanal work. And then once you learn how to do it, then you can be devolved to, into a more consistent form. And then it can be outsourced, it can be automated, or it can just be done by lower skill people. So yeah, you can think about kind of a dynamic evolution of tasks. And that's sort of what, and notice in this model, right, this, the unit interval is always 1, but the index is always moving, right? So J is rising over time to sort of reflect that dynamic process. Good. Okay. Basically, there are 3 things that come out of this model, and I realize I've just sketched it. One is that, but these are things we're going to attempt to test. One is that augmentation creates new tasks, and automation does not. right? So we're going to directly measure augmentation and automation. And we're going to see if that's true, whether when we see augmentation innovations, they create new tasks. When we see automation innovations, even though they occur in the same place, whether they do not have this effect. Second is we're going to show that new task creation or test responds elastically to demand shifts. We're going to test whether outward shifts in occupational demand accelerate the emergence of new tasks, whether inward shifts in occupational demand slow the emergence of new tasks. And then finally, we're going to ask whether automation and automation occur in the same occupations, as this model would predict, since they both respond to the same set of incentives, and whether they have imposing impacts on labor demand within occupations measured by either employment or wages. So that's where we're going. So now let me, so there are three key inputs into this, and I'll just state them here. I'm going to go into them in more detail. One is this catalog of new tasks over 8 decades, where we build on Jeffrey Lynn. A second is measuring technologies that complement occupational inputs, and we think this is an important contribution to the paper. And the other is measuring technologies that substitute for occupational outputs. And here, that latter category, we're very closely related to 2 papers, one by Michael Webb, who was a job market candidate last year out of Stanford, and the other is by Kogan et al., Leonid Kogan et al., Kogan, Papanicolaou, Schmidt, and Segmiller, where Brian Segmiller is our co-author on this paper. And he, in this other work, they look at technologies that substitute for occupational input. So really step 2 is kind of a key feature of this paper that is distinct from existing work. Okay, so how do we measure new work over 8 decades? Let me start with that. So we're going to use, this is kind of a grand schematic of our approach. So we're going to use 3 different primary data sources to build what we're doing. The first is this Census Alphabetical Index of Occupations. And I'll show you what that is. And we're going to use it to measure the emergence of new titles captured by the US Census between 1930 and 2018. So that's the first piece I'm going to talk about. The next 2 pieces will be how we measure innovation or augmentation and how we measure automation. And I'll come back to those 2 in a second. So let me start here. So the Census, the US Census Bureau, every year creates a detailed list of occupational titles, about 15 to 30,000 per volume, and industry titles, 10 to 20,000 per volume. And each title is classified to one of the census occupation or industry codes that you would see in a public use data set. These volumes are intended as a coding aid for census employees. They look at what people write in on their census forms, and they have to classify them to these codes. And the way they do it is they look at these intermediate titles, and then they classify them. So, there might be 30,000 occupational titles, but ultimately there are only 400 categories that they use in the final documents. So we're going to use the Census Alphabetical Indices from 1930 to 2018 those are going to be an input into our analysis. So the key thing is that these are updated every decade. So for example, the 1990 index says there are about 21,000 industries and 30,000 occupational titles. It's comprehensive and it's continuously updated through review of census and survey questionnaires. So the basic content of the 1990 index is derived largely from previous editions. However, about 1,000 new titles have been added to each of the industry and occupation listings. And this is why are they added? Because people start writing in things that the Census Bureau hasn't seen before. If enough people write it in, they make a note of that. They go to the supervisor and say, we haven't seen this before. Should we add this to the list? The supervisor says yes or no, often by doing some research, and then it gets added to the volume. And this basic idea of comparing successive editions of the Census Alphabetical Index is really Jeff Lynn's idea. That's one of the things he does in the 2011 paper. So what we do is we do this much more comprehensively.
David?
Yes, please.
I think there might be some kind of delay in the measurement, right? Only when one job title become very kind of mainstream, you can observe this one and then start to kind of measure.
So that's a good question. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip how we do this because I think you get the idea, and we go right to the examples. So these are, I hope that's okay, but I think in the interest of time, that's probably a good choice. So these are new titles that are added in each decade between 1940 and 2018. So first, let me start on the left-hand side. So in 1940, automatic welding machine operator, airplane designer, textile chemist, engineer of computer applications. Notice, for example, in 1980, they add controllers of remotely piloted vehicles. In 2000, they add artificial intelligence specialists. In 2010, technicians of wind turbines, 2018, pediatric vascular surgeons. So surprisingly to us, the lag is not nearly as great as you would expect. In fact, it's like I was shocked to see that artificial intelligence specialist was added in 2000, right? And in fact, if you look at some of the things that are emerging even now, so I've seen the most recent write-in data, which is confidential, but I can like give you an example. So for example, a title that people are writing down frequently now is drone camera operator, and that will be added to the volume. So I guess the resolution is high enough. Enough people are sampled that you do they still pick up things even when only 100 people write them in. Let me, on the other hand side, so most of these examples I've given you are things that have to do with people who use a new technology, who create a new technology, who sell a technology, service a technology, or integrate it into some other domain. On the right-hand side, and that's a good chunk of the example. So for example, in 1939, there were 80 occupations that were specific to automobile repair, 80 titles. By 2018, there were about 163 titles, and many of them referred to expertise with technologies that didn't exist in 1940. So for example, air conditioning on motor vehicles, disc brakes, fuel injection, right? All new technology. So clearly, a lot of these new titles on the left-hand side reflect demand for new specialized expertise, right? It's not simply that the jobs are getting narrower, it's that the knowledge domain in which they work is getting deeper, and so you require more types of specialized skills. Just as prominent in these data are many new services that are not specifically technology related, right? So acrobatic dancer, tattooer, pageant director, hypnotherapist, amusement park worker. I should have given the example of a chat room monitor. Sommelier, that's the person who sells you, wine at a restaurant, et cetera. And clearly, these do not have the same technological components as the one on the left, but they are new services. They're specialized. That's why they have new titles, why people give them. And in general, you would expect, although it's not absolutely the case, that there's some specialized knowledge that goes with them, at least initially, right? So as work specializes, people become, being a tattooer is obviously different from being a cosmetologist or makeup artist. Being a sommelier obviously requires some specialized knowledge, or even if you find like different types of people who teach yoga, there's lots and lots of counseling and coaches and so on. All of them, or most of them presumably, have some differentiated knowledge that's associated with that work, although the depth of that knowledge is an open question. Does that answer the question about the how these things appear and how up to date they are? Okay, cool. So let me give you a sense of what these do over time before I move into the analytic component of the talk. So this shows you between 1940 and 1980, basically the stock of existing work and the flow of new work for people with high school or lower education. So how do we do this? And I think this is an important point that I should clarify right now. In the census data, we do not observe who does what new work, right? We observe these new titles emerging, but what's actually in the data itself are employment by these broad occupations, these 600 occupations, for example, that the Census Bureau actually codes, and they never record this intermediate information. So how we calculate the share of employment in new work is essentially we say, look, let's say there's 100 titles in an occupation, 100 of these micro titles, actually maybe there might be 1,000, but let's say there's 100, and 10 of them are new this decade. We assume that 10% of employment in that occupation is in new work, right? It's a rough approximation. And then if we're trying to allocate that by education group, we just look at the education distribution of work in that occupation. And if the work is, 90% high school graduates, then we say, 90% of that is done by high school, the other 10% by college. And so that's how we create this picture. So it's an approximation. And most of what we're going to do that follows analytically does not depend upon this approximation. This is just a way of visualizing the data. So for the first 4 decades of our sample, you can see that the flow of new work and the stock of existing work for high school grads is very similar, right? So most high school graduate employment is in construction, transportation, production, and clerical, and most new work is also in those categories. If we look over the subsequent 4 decades, you can see that most existing work for high school graduates also continues to be in construction, transportation, production, and clerical. But the flow of new work moves out, right? Particularly into personal services, many of these quite low paid, and somewhat into the technical and sales and professional work. And so the flow of new work polarizes relative to the stock of existing work. And so this sort of shows you potentially that these new titles are kind of a leading indicator of the way that work is changing. If you make the same figure for college graduates, some college or above, you can see that the flow and stock of work are highly specialized. They're much more in clerical, professional, and managerial. Notice, by the way, that there's lots of new clerical work emerging in this period. Then if we look over the next 4 decades, you can see that the flow of new work becomes even more right-shifted, right? More in professional, more in technical, more in managerial. And interestingly, the flow of new clerical work slows, reflecting what we think of as automation. So that gives you a sense of how these track how these change over time relative to the kind of stock of what's happening. So now so that's how we measure new work. Now let me talk about how we measure automation and augmentation.
Hello, David.
Yes.
I have one question.
Yep.
So in the last slide, so you want to argue that those changes are caused by the demand side, right? So the occupation change are caused by the demand. Right? This is
well, I haven't made that argument.
Okay.
But I'm happy to entertain it.
So you were going to make this argument, right?
I'm gonna make that. I'm not entirely taking a state. I'm gonna argue that the flow of new work is partly driven by demand. Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, I see. Do you have a question on that, or are you just checking?
Checking. Just checking.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay, that's right. So I don't want to argue that all of this is the result of one single force, because I think that it's a little more complex. I don't want, that's sort of an overclaim relative to what I can show. I do want to argue that the flow of new work does stem in part from demand shifts, and we can see where those are coming from. So to do this, I need to be able to measure this augmentation and automation. So what we're going to do is we're going to use patent data to measure innovative activity and try to classify it according to automation and augmentation. So let me just say there's a ton of literature that uses patent text as data, and it's been used for all kinds of amazing things. We're using a specific purpose, which is to measure, effectively labor replacing and labor complementary technologies. There are a number of papers that attempt to measure these labor replacing components of technology. So I mentioned the paper by our co-author, Brian Segmiller, right? Kogan, Papanicolaou, Schmidt, and Segmiller, the paper by Michael Webb, and another paper recently by Matt Putman. As far as we know, this is the first paper that attempts to look at the other side of that, which is the complementarity between technology and labor. And that's what we hope that's where we think we're making the most important kind of progress. So how are we going to do this? We're going to use a patent corpus, all patents between 1930 and 2018. And we're going to use natural language processing to try to link them to 2 domains. One domain is going to be the Census Alphabetical Index that basically describes the outputs of occupations and industries. So we're going to think that patents that effectively link to that domain as potentially being augmenting. They're increasing the value or the quality or the type of services provided by an industry or occupation. Conversely, let me just show you the other side of this. We're going to do the other side of this, where we're going to link these patents to the Dictionary of Occupational Titles that describes the inputs into an occupation or industry, the work done by people, right? So what I want to be clear is we're using the same body information, this patent corpus, and the way we're going to attempt to identify augmentation versus automation patents is just by using the same natural language processing tools and looking for links to 2 different but related domains. one describing human inputs into work, the other describing the outputs of work. And our hypothesis, which we'll test, is that those will capture different components of innovation that have different implications for the way labor is used.
Can I ask one question regarding the natural language processing?
Mm-hmm.
I think the input into the job titles and output of from job titles must be very similar in the language sense, right?
Yeah, so absolutely. There is a lot of overlap. And so it's really a kind of, it's not at all obvious that this would work, right?
Yeah,
you can imagine they would be sufficiently indistinct that you would get the same thing, and they are going to be correlated. So we are, that was the big aha for us in this paper, that we actually do see a lot of evidence that they are distinct. But I mean, I don't think you certainly don't need to believe that on ex ante grounds, right? Suspend disbelief until you see the evidence and then decide if you find it convincing. So this, by the way, just to give you some sense, these are the outputs. So for example, if you look at the Census Index of Industries or the Census Index of Occupations, these are the books, those volumes I was describing to you. They're highly, highly detailed. So for example, an industry just within bookkeeping, accounting, and auditing, right? These are all the industries under bookkeeping, accounting, and auditing. So accountant office, accountant firm, accountant service, banking, insurance. These are the major users of bookkeepers and accountants and auditing clerks. Here are examples of the micro occupations under the title. So account information clerk, account receivable clerk, foreign exchange clerk, et cetera. So these are all, they're a kind of a mixture of what people do and what the industries and occupations produce, right? So they are, broadly descriptive. On the Dictionary of Occupational Title side, conversely, right, this is what the DOT entry would look like for a bookkeeper. Keeps records of financial transactions using calculator or computer, verifies, allocates, and posts details of business transactions, summarize details in separate ledgers or computer files, etc. So these are qualitatively similar, these two sides of these. The main difference is that this one attempts to describe what the worker does, and this one attempts to describe what the service produces, right? And those obviously have a lot of overlap. So really, it's an empirical question about whether they can be distinguished. So here's how we do it. So first, we take all three of these corpora, these titles, the patents, and the DOT. And let me say, this is not just the new titles, it's all titles. And we get the same results if we strip out the new titles, right? So it's not depending upon matching to new titles. We extract vectors of word embeddings for each of them. Word embeddings are basically geometric representations of the content of a word, or the meaning of a word. So colors would be in a similar piece of the vector space, as would the word for compute and think would be in similar pieces of the vector space, but the word for tree and airplane would be in very different pieces, right? So it's a kind of a 300-dimensional, and this is, we're not building this to scratch. This has been around for some years, and it's just a way, and the reason it's important to use these word embeddings as opposed to simply the bag of word approach of just looking for word overlaps is that the vocabularies used in patents are very different from the vocabularies used in descriptions of occupations. And so the technical terms obviously will not be there. And so the purpose of word embeddings is in some sense to translate those into a common frame where technical terms for words and more common terms for words will be in the same meaning space. We then look for overlaps. So we turn these into weighted averages of these word embeddings. And then we look for similarities between the patents and either the title corpus, which is our measure of augmentation, or the patents and the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, which is our measure of automation. So I'm sorry, did I say measure of augmentation, measure of automation? We calculate the cosine similarity, and then we just retain the most similar patents, and then we sum for these occupation industry patent pairs the count of patent matches in each decade, right? So we say for an industry occupation pair, how many augmentation patents are you exposed to? How many automation patents are you exposed to? So we calculate the flows of these in each decades, and we relate them to the occupation industry pairs that they are connected to, right? the main thing I want to emphasize about this is we follow a completely parallel procedure for the augmentation and the automation patterns, right? So there's no hand tuning of what we're doing here. And we're not taking one approach to one and a different approach to the other. They use exactly the same technology, the same set of inputs, which is this pattern corpus. The only difference is the domain to which we're targeting when looking for overlaps. Okay, so here's an example, and you can see both the strengths and weaknesses of this approach. So for example, here's patents that are linked to the bookkeeping, accounting, and auditing clerk occupation. So these are augmentation patents as our system classifies them. Universal credit card, electronic cash register, method and system for personal identification, intelligent portable interactive personal data system, etc. These are examples of patents linked to occupational inputs, automation, check verification system, check processing system, automated bank transaction security system, etc. So I could give you more examples. You can see that these are somewhat distinct. They're not highly distinct. And some of these patents could be linked to both. And some of them you could make an argument about they belong in a different category than they're in, right? So we're not taking a stand on that. We're simply going to use the outputs and see how they work. And I should say, by the way, what I'm describing here is the very first effort we made. This is the paper I'm in the process of revising. I'm not presenting the revised work because I'm not as top on it because it's a little too early, but we've tried various versions of this that actually produce very similar results. So in our current version, for example, we use the top 5% of patents and we weight them by their citations. And we do a little more, anyway, it produces surprisingly similar results. This is not a highly tuned kind of targeted activity where we, one way of doing it works and another does not. Just to give you a sense, here's a scatter plot of occupations according to their automation patent exposure and their augmentation patent exposure. These are for 1980 to 2018. So the first thing to notice is that there's a high correlation, right? There's a correlation of 0.6 or an R squared of about 0.36, right? So many things are on the diagonal. So for example, childcare workers and college instructors are not exposed to a lot of automation or a lot of augmentation as far as we can measure it. On the other hand, power plant operators are exposed to a lot of both a lot of things that are automating their work and a lot of things that are potentially augmenting their work. The interesting examples are in the off diagonal, things that are getting a lot of augmentation, but not a lot of automation or vice versa. So things that appear to be on this upper quadrant, mechanical engineers or operation and system research and analysts, those appear to be getting a lot of augmentation, but they're not so many of their activities are seen to be subject to automation patterns. If we instead look at cabinet makers and bench carpenters, programmers of CNC machines, typesetters, pharmacists, those are occupations that appear to be experiencing a lot of automation, but not so many things that might be augmenting them. And obviously that's just a descriptive fact. It's not a test of these relationships, but it just gives you a sense of what the data are doing. Okay. The other thing I want to just point out before I move into the analytic phase is the structure of patents is changing a lot over time. And this is going to matter to the degree to which they target different occupations. So if you look from 1900 to 2018, we break patents here into 10 categories. These are 10 broad categories according to their CPC codes. And this is a stacked area plot, so it shows you the fraction in each over time. Obviously, the count is rising. And you can see roughly 3 periods in this figure. From effectively 1900 to 1940, you could sort of think we're in a kind of a machine age. Most of the patents are in transportation, in manufacturing processes, and in engineering, construction, and mining. As we move into the period from 1940 to roughly 1980, you can sort of see a chemicals and metal ages emerging. Chemistry and metallurgy is the thing that's growing most rapidly relative to other categories. So you can think of this as much more high-tech manufacturing. Then as you move into 1980, you see a very clear break or a clear change in trend where 2 categories come to dominate all of the others. And those are instruments and information and electronics and electricity, right? So as we move into the information era, the composition of innovations, at least as registered in patents, changes quite dramatically. And to the degree that those innovations target different domains or the different occupations are implicated by those, that's going to have, that's going to potentially affect what is complemented and what is substituted, what is augmented and what is automated. Okay, so now let me kind of bring you to the kind of the evidence part. That's all descriptive. So the first thing I want to look at is the relationship between these different measures of innovation, both the augmentation and automation, and the relationship to new task creation. So what our model says is that when there's augmentation occurring, we should see, as measured by these augmentation patterns, we should see new tasks emerging. When there's automation occurring, we should not see new tasks being created. Right now, let me be clear. It's not that they'll be eliminated. We don't get to see tasks being eliminated. Unfortunately, our volumes only record new things. They don't say something is not being done anymore. And it may be that automation creates new automation tasks that we don't see. But in terms of labor using tasks, right, our prediction is that augmentation patterns spur the emergence of new tasks, new titles, and automation patterns do not. So this is how we test that. So effectively, this is, we're going to, in each decade, from 1948 to 2018, the dependent variable here is the flow of new titles in occupational category J over some decade T, where that decade might be 1940, 50, 50, 60, et cetera. We're going to use the inverse hyperbolic sign, or we're going to use percentiles because there's a lot of zeros, although that's not crucial. The explanatory variable is going to be the augmentation exposure of that occupation. We'll then add automation later on. Again, we're going to use percentiles or the inverse hyperbolic sign. We're going to control for the size of that occupation, only because larger occupations sort of, kind of mechanically tend to get more titles. We don't have to control for that. And then we're going to put in some specifications, occupation dummies or occupation times time dummies. And the prediction here is simply that this coefficient will tend to be positive, i.e. we will see new titles emerging where we see more of these augmentation of patterns occurring. So let me sort of show you the regression table, then I'll show you a figure that shows you what's going on. So this basically says if an occupation that is exposed to 10% higher augmentation patterns measured actually in log terms, we'll see about 1.4% more rapid emergence of new titles. That's our basic descriptive result. We can add occupation fixed effects and occupation employment. We can also add occupation by year fixed effects. It appears to be pretty robust. We can do this measuring these augmentation patterns two different ways. One based on industry linkages projected down to the level of occupations that are in them. The other is going directly to occupational descriptions. They give you very similar results. Let me show you why this result is so robust. This shows you those 12 categories of occupations I put up initially, ranked from lowest paying to highest paying. On the x-axis is the percentile of augmentation patterns, either over 1940 to 1980 or 1990 to 2018. On the y-axis is the percentile of emergence of new titles in that 4-decade period. You can see in 23 of 24 cases, right, this relationship is clearly upward sloping. Occupations, within these broad occupations, where we see more where we see more augmentation patterns occurring, we see more new titles emerging. Right? Now, again, you can think of that as descriptive. It's totally reasonable, right? You can say which is driving which, right? It doesn't really take a stand on causality, right? And this goes to the question that was asked earlier. Maybe the patterns are responding to the occupation and so on. That's fine for now. Just that this is a really sort of first order feature of the data. In a second piece of this, I'm going to look at whether we see the same relationship for automation patterns, right? Which is a distinct implication. And for this, at least for now, I'm just going to focus on 1980 to 2018, where we can build a consistent occupation panel, so we can look at changes within occupations. We actually have gone back earlier, but I don't have that in these slides. So here is the regression. So again, this is the dependent variable is the occupational new title count between 1980 and 2018. This is at a decade level. So basically there are 4 decade periods 303 occupations in each period. The coefficients are the same, or almost the same as I showed you earlier, which is what you would expect, because I showed you in that figure, it doesn't matter whether you do the earlier 4 decades or latter 4 decades, the relationship is quite stable. So augmentation predicts the emergence of new titles. In the 4th column, I also put in automation patents. That appears to be positive as well, but remember that these two are highly correlated. So in the 5th through 7th columns, I put in augmentation patents and automation patents. And when I do, it's only the augmentation patents that are predictive of the emergence of new titles, right? So even though these two are closely related to one another, they do seem to have distinct relationships to the emergence of new titles, right? In fact, we do have a slide where we do this for 1940 to 2018. It's much harder to do this automation patent thing correctly there, but even so, when we do it, we see something similar. Let me just go back to where we were. Okay. So that's a kind of a first indication that these patents, although they're highly correlated, have different content. Right? Okay. The second piece of evidence I want to turn to, and I'm actually, I probably, yeah, anyway, this is the empirical part of this will be relatively compact, is I want to look at the relationship between demand shifts and new task creation. And here, so, that effectively took, you don't have to take a strong stand on what's causing what in that previous set of regressions, right? They're showing an association. So in this case, I want to now isolate demand forces that I understand well and ask whether they affect the flow of new titles. In particular, I want to look at both negative demand forces and positive demand forces and see whether they work in the way we expect them to. So I don't know why that slide is there. Oh, sorry, this appears to be a repeat. Okay, here we go. All right. So, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a negative demand shock, which reflects the impact of Chinese import competition on U.S. manufacturing employment. And I want to ask whether occupations that are exposed to more import competition, whether we see a decline in the emergence of new titles in those occupations. So let me be clear about how we do this. So we look at, this is obvious as it should be. Okay, great. Okay, so for each industry, we look at its change in import penetration. This is basically domestic absorption of that industry's outputs between 1991 and 2014. And this is the observed measure. This is the change in Chinese imports into the United States in that industry divided by output of that industry plus imports minus exports. We instrument this, or we're going to use a reduced form approach, using the change in 8 other high income countries simultaneously. So we're effectively isolating the component due to China's rising productivity and falling prices and diminished trade barriers in moving those, causing exports to rise. And for each of those, we're going to multiply this industry level variable by the exposure of each occupation to that industry. So it's effectively the fraction of industry occupation J's employment that is in industry I, right? So an occupation that's heavily in, that most of its employment occurs in an industry that experiences a big trade shock is then more exposed than an occupation whose employment is mostly in non-exposed industries. And so we're asking whether, if we see a large increase in the exogenous component of import exposure, whether we see a decline in new titles in that occupation, new title emergence. So let me show you pictorially how this identification works. So on here is our measure of occupational exposure to this trade shock. Here are our 12 major occupations, and they're lined up from least exposed to most exposed, right? Health services at the bottom, at the top is production, as you would expect. The black dot shows you the mean exposure of that occupation to the trade shock. That's not the variation we use. the variation we use, because we're going to effectively include main effects for each of these occupations. So variation we use is the contrast between detailed occupations within those categories that are more and less exposed. So for example, among production occupations, textile sewing machine operators are highly exposed, power plant operators are not, right? Why? Well, textiles is heavily trading, electricity generation is not traded to any important extent. Or within clerical and administrative work, shipping and receiving clerks are highly exposed, but insurance adjusters are not. Or within professionals, electrical engineers are more exposed than primary school teachers, right? So that's the source of variation we're using to look for this effect. Is that clear? Okay, cool. So here's the first set of results. So here is the change in new title emergence, this is just the rate of new title emergence between 1990 and 2018 within occupations. And so there's 612 observations, right? 303 are 306 occupations. I think I should say 606 actually. And here is the result. This says basically a 10% more rapid rate of emergence of growth of import exposure is associated with a reduction of about 1.2 percentage points in the rate of emergence of new titles. Notice, by the way, that we're controlling for augmentation. So these augmentation patterns are always highly positive. So these are not competing effects. In fact, in some ways, they're pretty correlated because production occupations are differentially exposed to augmentation patterns. Anything that has a technological component or is in manufacturing gets lots and lots more patenting. So in many ways, the occupations that are relatively exposed to import competition are also the ones that are relatively exposed to these augmentation patterns. So these things actually tend to be positively correlated. And if I put this in alone, you would still see it's negative, but it wouldn't be as precise. Now, you might say, okay, isn't this just like, maybe this is always true of these set of occupations? Maybe this has been going on for a long time. So this shows you a falsification test where you do the same thing for 1980 and 1990, before this trade, the rapid growth of import competition in these activities. And you can see that this relationship is stable, and this is smaller and not significant. It's not, you might say, well, these two aren't really that different. And that's, I think that's fair. So if you, another version of this, we do this in percentiles. Most things in the paper we do in percentiles, as well as in terms of the IHS. It's not clear which you should prefer. Here is the main results for 1990 through 2018. And here's the kind of placebo test for 1980 and 1990. And what you can see is there really is an important difference, right? So in this period, when this trade shock is occurring, we do see a slowdown in the emergence of new work. And so why is this important? Well, it says that it's not that demand doesn't change the quantity of work, but it changes the type of work. That where you have demand expanding, you see new tasks arising. And where you have demand contracting, that slows down, right? So any area in which you effectively have if you were, for example, to stimulate demand and activity, not only would you get, quote, more work, but you get more new work. You would get more differentiated activities that potentially use new skills. And so it's a different margin of work creation. Here's a complementary exercise. For this one, I'm going to look at another force, which is demographically induced changes in demand within industries. So for this approach, I'm going to use we're going to follow the paper by Della Vigna and Paulette that uses the relationship between household consumption by age group and changes in the age structure of the population to predict changes in industry demand, right? So their paper, just if you haven't read it, is actually trying to say, look at the effect this has on stock prices. So effectively it says, if you're in 1965, or let's say 1943, and you see a huge rise in the birth rate, then you ought to be able to predict that 12 years later, you see a big increase in demand for bicycles. and that will drive up the stock of bicycle producing companies. And in fact, the main point of that paper is that people don't seem to anticipate this, even though it's knowable all the time. But we're not doing that. We simply estimate cross-sectionally in 1984 through 1988, the relationship between household age structure and the set of goods that household consumes. We then link those to the industries that that produce them. And then we just walk changes in the age structure forward over time to get predicted changes in industry demand. And then we ask whether those predict changes in new title emergence. So that's what we're doing in this exercise. And again, we use the same approach where we calculate this demand shift at the industry level, and then we project it to the level of occupations according to their employment share within those industries. So an occupation that's heavily employed in bicycles, if bicycles are expanding, we'd expect it to be more exposed to this. And the question is whether we see new titles emerging more rapidly in these occupations, even potentially controlling for the rate of growth of employment. So let me just give you a sense of what this looks like. And so these are the occupations. You saw these earlier. This is a subset, it's only a subset are labeled. These are the predicted new title emergence based on augmentation. These are predicted new title emergence based on demand shifts. And what's important to see here is these are really a distinct set of occupations, right? So the ones where we predict a lot of new titles, for example, are electrical engineers, computer system analysts, electrical engineers again, sorry, or many of these medical and sales occupations, right? Some of these are high in demographic demand shifts, some are low. But some of the occupations that are very high in demographic demand shifts have almost no technology exposure as we expect to see them, right? So real estate occupations, funeral directors, waiters and waitresses, food preparation workers, primary school teachers, housekeepers, right? So you can see many of these are going to be, demand for those things are going to be driven by changes in household structure or age structure over time, but they don't have a technology component. So this is picking up, again, a distinct source of variation. Right? I showed you before, we have the augmentation that's distinct from the trade shock. This will be distinct again from the demographic demand change. So this is the results that come out of that, right? So again, the dependent variable is the emergence of new titles between 1980 and 2018. And here we have this demand exposure measure. Again, we have the augmentation measure. We put in a variety of different controls, right? Industry shares and occupation shares. Let's see, is there anything else I wanted to highlight about that? So the main thing you can see here, right, is similar to above. For example, this says about a 10% increase in projected demand in an occupation's employment predicts kind of 1.5 to 2% faster rate of new work emergence. And again, this is distinct from the augmentation factor, right? It's distinct from the technological component. In fact, I could put these in separately. They would each attain significance, right? And so these really are distinct dimensions of variation. And again, let's see, and I should say and in these models, we control for the size of occupations, right? So we're allowing that. We don't want the mechanical component of occupation size to just be driving the emergence of new titles. So controlling for those shares attempts to neutralize that. And it doesn't, in fact, it's not important to our results, but it's important to the interpretation of them that not be driven simply by scale. Okay, so let me then bring you to the kind of last empirical step. And this is for employment and wages. And so what I've showed you so far, right, is that, you can predict new titles, where they occur, right? That they are predicted by augmentation, but not by automation. That they are predicted, that their emergence slows down when you have inward demand shifts stemming from trade, for example, that their emergence accelerates when you see outward demand shifts stemming from demographics, for example. But that's not about employment per se, that's just about new titles. You could have lots of new titles emerging or not emerging, and it wouldn't have necessarily any implications for how much employment growth there is, right? So we're going to look at changes in employment within industry occupation cells between 1980 and 2019. So in fact, in particular, we're going to run this regression where we have the change in employment in industry occupation cell. We're going to, as a function of augmentation exposure and automation exposure, where we're going to put in time dummies and occupation main effects for the broad occupations. The dependent variable here is going to be the Davis-Haltiwanger-Schuh employment change, right? This is kind of a log where you can have 0 on either side, not on both sides, right? So it's just effectively the proportional change where you normalize by the average of start and end year employment. And I want to emphasize that this regression with this second term, this automation term, is effectively already in the paper by Kogan et al., including Segneller, who's one of our co-authors, and in the paper by Michael Webb. So it's not the same measure, but it's a related measure. And so we already know from existing work that we would expect this coefficient to be negative. Right? And so the question is whether we're picking up a different dimension of variation, right, from this augmentation pattern, whether it actually has a different effect, even though it's happening in the same place. Is this associated with actually new net increases in employment, at least relative employment? So here is the basic regression. So in the first column, I put in the augmentation alone. It's not that precise. Once we add broad occupation by year fixed effects, this becomes precise and positive. Okay. In the second column, I put in the third column, I put in the automation measure, and that enters the negative sign. It's not that robust. When you put them in both together, in fact, they both are predictive in opposite directions, right? So augmentation is, predictive of growth of employment. Automation is predictive of contraction of employment, and simultaneously. So I'll show you a figure that sort of kind of attempts to summarize this. So this says.
Sorry, David.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have one question. So
Go ahead.
In the last slide.
Mm-hmm.
So in the last slide, could you? Okay. So the column 6, the last column. So basically, the magnitude are similar, right?
Correct.
So for the automation, it's like 1 minus 1.8, and for the augmentation is close to 2. So basically, it means that so they will cancel each other, right?
Well, it depends actually on how much there is of each, right? Okay. So it says for the same quantity, they would be kind of offsetting. It doesn't actually tell you what that quantity is.
Okay. Yes,
but I mean, it's a great question. And that's actually something we're working on right now, is trying to quantify that and say, I don't want to overclaim, because in some sense, I don't want to claim that this is necessarily a comprehensive measure of all the innovations that occur, right? It's the innovations that occur in patents. However, it is, what's going to be clear, and I wish I had this already in front of you today, is that these are occurring in somewhat different places. They're not identical, and that much more of the augmentation patterns will be associated with kind of professional and technical and managerial work. And many more of the automation patterns will be associated with many of those middle skill activities, the clerical, administrative, production, and operative positions. And so, they are going to have different distributional consequences. So they're going to predict growth in one set of occupations and contraction in another. And so both will be ongoing, and every occupation will be exposed to some of both in most cases. But the net effect is going to differ across sectors, or differ across occupations, and ultimately across skill groups as well.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, good. So just to show you a picture of this effectively is that regression. This is the employment change. This says holding automation fixed, occupations exposed to more augmentation tend to grow. Holding augmentation fixed, occupations exposed to more automation tend to grow. So these are basically these are partial regressions, right? And they are just a pictorial version of exactly the equation we were just looking at. And they're bin scatters, I should say. So those are not each a single data point. The final exercise, and this is a little bit, well, let me qualify it later. I want to look at wages as well, whether wages within occupations change differentially as a function of automation and augmentation. Now, I should be clear, we don't have a strong prediction here because the model effectively assumes that the supply of labor is perfectly elastic across occupations, or sectors as we call them, right? So it says they could rise or fall in general equilibrium, but you wouldn't really see differentiated changes within occupations, right? So we're a little bit on thin ice in testing this. However, it is the case in the papers by Webb and Segmuller that I mentioned earlier, they do actually tend to find negative effects for automation. So we figured we would explore this. Now, an issue with running this type of regression, trying to relate the changes in wages within occupation to these exposure to automation and augmentation is, of course, occupations are growing and shrinking in response to those same forces. And that's going to have first order compositional effects on who's working in those occupations. So for example, a recent paper by Michael Bohm and by this gentleman here, I don't want to mispronounce his or her name actually, shows, for example, that occupations that are growing will tend to have falling wages, and occupations that are shrinking will tend to have rising wages purely as a function of composition. Because when occupations are growing rapidly, they tend to get younger people with lower experience. When occupations are shrinking, they tend to age, and the young people don't enter them, and the more senior people stay. And so that's going to cause a kind of mechanical relationship between changes in automation, augmentation, and the wage levels within occupations. So to attempt to deal with that, we're going to do the following thing. We're going to estimate in each of our years a kind of a cross-section log wage regression of wages on a saturated model for sex, race, ethnicity, education level, and all interactive with age. Right. So effectively, we're predicting what wage we would expect cross-sectionally. So then, for each of these individuals, we calculate a predicted wage. Then we collapse that to industry occupation cells. So this is so we can now look at the change in the wage, the change in the predicted wage within the industry occupation cell as a function of automation augmentation, and then finally the composition adjusted wage, which is the change in the observed wage minus the change in the predicted wage. Right, that's kind of a residual wage change. Go ahead. Question?
Yeah, I have one question regarding this controlling for the composition. As one occupation expands, you're gonna also expect low ability guys to join. Then this kind of thing cannot account for ability, right?
That's right. So this can only account for the demographic. So that would be a source of downward bias, right? Oh, sorry. Oh, well, actually, it depends which way you're going. Yeah, that's right. It'd be a source of downward bias, right? So we can see, for example, if let's say an occupation, let's say systems operators is exposed to a lot of augmentation and it grows. Well, it's going to tend to get younger, less experienced workers, right? So that would cause the wages to fall. If conditional on, age and experience, they're also less skilled. That will cause wage to fall further, and we won't be able to account for that, right? So in some sense, if you take that story seriously, it said we would be biased against finding any positive relationship, right, between augmentation and wage growth, right? Because even after adjusting for the composition of people in the occupation, the skill level is falling in a way that we can't measure, right? And conversely, for automation, you would expect the opposite. Because automation causes cells to shrink. So compositionally, they get higher wage, they get older, more experienced. And if also the people who stay are the higher skilled members of that occupation, right, that would cause even adjusting for composition, that would cause wages to tend to rise. Okay, so here is let me just show you the pictorial version of this rather than the regression version. So we're predicting employment and wage growth within 3-digit industry and occupation cells. And I'm just going to set these coefficients equal and opposite one another for the sake of pictorial simplicity. And so here's what it looks like. So first, this just replicates the figure I showed you a minute ago, but in a reduced version, right? The explanatory variable is augmentation minus automation, right? So if this is positive, there's relatively more augmentation. If it's negative, relatively more automation. And this is the change in proportional change in employment. This is positive, as we already knew. In the second panel, I show you this for the expected wage, right? The worker composition. And this is strongly negative, right? So it says occupations that are exposed to more augmentation, they're growing, and the workers that are in them are observably less skilled, or in other words, they're really less experienced is the main thing, right? We would expect them to have lower wages. If it's exposed to a lot of automation, conversely, the occupation shrinks, but the predicted skill level rises, and so wages rise. Then in the third column, I show you the composition adjusted wages. These are the observed change in wage net of the expected change in wage given the changes in the composition, right? And this is positive, pretty strongly positive, not very strongly positive, saying that all else equal, we seem to see some evidence of rising wages in those occupations, net of the change in who's working in them. I don't want to overemphasize this result because I'm not as confident in it, and we may not keep it in the final version of the paper. The main channel that we're seeing is employment, right? The real takeaway here, and the employment figure is component is actually this is actually pretty informative. Notice that this coefficient is 10 times the size of this coefficient, right? So this says that even if you take those numbers quite literally, it says the employment margin is an order of magnitude more important for the ultimate payments to workers than is the composition component, right? You could add these in some sense, they're log additive, right? So you could say the effect on employment is, let's say, is 4% for a 10% change, right? If you add to that the wage, that rises to 4.4%, right? You can add those two together because they're effectively log terms, right? So the main thing that we would say is the wage bill is rising strongly in augmentation exposed occupations and falling strongly in automation exposed occupations. And the primary mechanism through which that is occurring is through changes in the size of those occupations. Okay, so so let me draw some conclusions. And actually, before I even summarize, let me just give you a tiny example. Excuse me, and I'm sorry I don't have slides for this, but take an example from the pandemic. So we know that during the pandemic, many more people started working from home. But of course, the people who work the most from home are people who are doing knowledge work, right? People who are doing, things that can be done without physical contact. Many of them are people who are doing, analytic work, managerial work, interpersonal work, even services, remote services. If you look at data from US patents, this is in a recent paper by Nick Bloom and a co-author, you can see that there's a huge surge in patents that involve work from home technology after the year, starting in the year 2020, right? And so you see this endogenous technological response where innovation occurs. My guess, this is speculative because I haven't done the analysis, is that many of those are going to be augmentation patents, right? Patents that effectively make working from home more productive, right? They're going to be things that improve your camera, that improve throughput, that improve the quality of video services. And so the consequence of that is those will be complementary to people who do that type of work, right? So that induced innovation will be effectively like new task creation for people who do work from home. And so the pandemic will generate an endogenous technological response that is complementary to a set of tasks. And of course, those tasks are done much more by skilled workers. And so we're likely to see And I suspect this would actually be really interesting to do, is we should expect to see a lot more automation patents in services that that in some sense were constrained by the pandemic, right? Things that, like checkout kiosks or robotics that handle warehousing and so on. We haven't checked that. It's actually an interesting idea. And so again, you can see that the locus of automation and augmentation are going to be changed by these specific types of demand shifts, and that's going to have implications down the road for what type of labor is in demand. Okay, so just to summarize, as far as we can estimate it, new work is quantitatively important. It's quite an approximate estimate for the reasons I explained, right? We don't see who works in new titles or how many people. We can only approximate that by using the share of new titles over the stock of existing titles. We estimate that about 2/3 of employment in 2018 is in job titles that didn't exist in 1940. I should say that Acemoglu and Restrepo come up with a relatively similar number, although they're using a shorter time period and a very, very different way of measuring it. The locus and the skill content of new work have shifted a lot over 8 decades, right? So a lot of new work creation in the first 4 post-World War II decades was in these middle skilled, high school intensive jobs. That has changed. For non-college workers, most of the new work creation is in much more lower paid personal services. Simultaneously, technical and professional work has become even more specialized. The new work creation is much more on the right-hand side of that figure. In fact, it even has moved out of office work and much more into professional and technical and managerial work. And this matches, by the way, the change of where patenting is occurring, where patent has moved into these information intensive areas. We can predict the locus of new work creation. So augmentation consistently predicts the emergence of new titles and the growth of new work between 1940 and 2018. Automation does not predict those things. Demand shifts predict where new titles emerge, both in terms of trade shocks that reduce demand or demographic shocks that increase demand. Finally, task displacement and new task creation occur simultaneously within many of the same occupations. They're both going on all the time, but they have opposing consequences for employment and for overall wage bills in those activities. And so in some sense, we kind of like to say among our co-authors, kind of new tasks are sort of, they're kind of the new work is kind of the dark matter of the task universe, right? We know it's out there, we suspect it's important, but we don't know how much of it there is, where it comes from, or what it contains. And hopefully this paper has told you, at least as a starting point, how important it is, what causes it to emerge, and what its consequences are for aggregate employment, at least aggregate employment in relative terms across occupations. So I will stop there and I welcome any further questions.
Yeah, thanks, David. Very fascinating. We still have several minutes left. Is there any questions?
David, can I ask a question? Great talk, first of all. Really enjoyed it.
Nice to see you, Hamning.
Great to see you. So one
Do you know that I was at Hamning's interview for his MIT
20 years ago?
That's 20 years ago.
Yes, I remember. David, so one thing that I always wanted to ask you is the following. So as this automation shifts the labor demand, and you always wonder, where absent of big changes in redistribution, where will be the demand for the goods produced by, the robots or whatever coming from, right? So there seem to be important societal kind of implications regarding how the market will work, right? We all love, goods produced by machines at a cheaper cost, but ultimately these goods will need to be purchased by people with income, right? Yep. So I don't know, it's not directly related to what you talk about, but I think your research has important implications in how we answer that question. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Of course, it's all speculative, but what we see in the case of lower educated workers is all this demand is shifting into personal services. And many of these are kind of luxury services, as I emphasized, like, tattoos and sommeliers, all kinds of coaches and trainers. And and so it appears to be, that work appears to be numerically abundant, but it doesn't tend to be that highly paid because it's not that specialized, right? For a lot of the high-end things that we see, they require high levels of worker education, whether that's in medicine, whether it's in these technical specialist occupations and so on. And there, the complementarities seem to be running towards high-skilled labor. And there's, of course, that tends to be scarce, tends to be specialized, and so tends to be highly paid. And so I do think that it's not that we're going to run out of consumers per se, but the distributional consequences do not appear very favorable. And of course, a lot of what we're doing is, is somewhat, is historically backward looking. It's hard to analyze data on the future. Already you can see this kind of polarization playing out, right? Especially in the 1980 to 2018 period, where all this new work is coming in around the edges for less educated workers rather than in the middle. We're, quite possibly in the cusp of in the midst of a pretty big change, having to do obviously with artificial intelligence, even much more than robotics, I would say. People always talk about robots because they're much more dramatic and they're fun, but AI is probably a much bigger deal. And there we don't have as clear a sense, right, of what it's going to do. I think the jury is really out. A lot of, the question is AI going to, in some sense, do to a lot of professional work what, office automation has done to a lot of clerical work? And we don't know. I welcome your thoughts on that.
No, thank you, David. I don't have I felt like the type of policy proposals like the UBI may be on the agenda for the society to think about when AI, for example, replaces a broader set of currently highly compensated occupations or workers, right? So, and eventually the society have become very much more productive as a whole, but the distribution of that output is, if it's very highly skilled or concentrated to a very small set of capital owners or set of a small set of workers, then I think there may be more more appetite for larger scale redistribution, just for the sake of the society as a whole, not necessarily.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. I hope we don't get to that place, because I think the political economy of that is so unpleasant and difficult to manage, right? That, the labor market has been, we've been so fortunate for the last the post-war period, right? That the labor market in some sense has, made a lot of labor scarce. There's a lot of, in the nature of technology, many labor skills that people commonly possess are scarce enough that they command a relatively high wage and are relatively productive. If we get to a setting where that does not, where we have to artificially compensate for that lack of scarcity, that creates a very big political economy problem. We're rich, but we don't have a natural means to distribute without, kind of forced redistribution. Right. I mean, one thing that's working in our favor in many ways is demographics, right? Rising education and shrinking cohorts of young people mean that there will be a lot of demand chasing a relatively small number of workers for a lot of these services that are growing. And as a consequence of that, we may see, rising pay without a lot of technological progress, right? Like what we're seeing right now in the very tight US labor market for a lot of these, restaurant workers and so on. They're all of a sudden, jobs are improving very rapidly.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe let me ask one.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So in your paper, you basically measure the new task using the new job titles, right?
Right.
I'm wondering whether this new job title is a good measure of new task, in the sense that over time, maybe there's new information technology, and people can know what exactly a detailed task are there for the old job titles. And then over time, they add this new job titles, but they are there, but we don't have enough information to kind of capture those things. Is that automatic automatic stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I think it's amazing that the Census Bureau has been doing this actually for decades and decades. It's, it's a great resource. And in fact, they've actually been doing it since the first volume is from 1915, but it covers changes from 1900 to 1910. And we have a similar, by the way, I should say, we have a similar exercise for new industry titles. So that everything I showed you today was for new occupation titles. We also have new industry titles between 1950 and 2018. And they actually also show a very similar pattern, that where we see augmentation, particularly, we see new industry titles emerging. I think it's an imperfect measure, and that is a sort of caveat to this entire paper, is that, you know, it's hard to say that we've captured all the new tasks or all the augmentation innovations or all the automation innovations. And that's why we're a little, I know many people would immediately jump to the structural model that sort of says, you know, and therefore X% and Y%. We're a little hesitant to do that because we feel like these are proxies and they're imperfect proxies. And so we think they're directionally very meaningful. But even, you know, maybe even in some, you know, cardinal sense, but with some unknown factor of proportionality. So I think it's a challenge, and there are newer, you know, more other efforts to measure new work. Use burning glass, for example, you know, job postings. I've done that in some of my work with AI, and I think that's really interesting. The virtue of this is that we can do it consistently over long periods of time, and we think there's been a, you know, a sort of a relatively consistent effort by the Census Bureau to record it. I should finally say that ultimately our analysis of employment doesn't depend on new titles, right? That just goes from the innovation and augmentation patterns directly to employment. The reason we don't look on new titles and we could instrument it is we've already used that as an outcome variable. So you don't want to then use it as an explanatory variable. We can, I will tell you that they're highly correlated, that where, you know, that employment change is positively associated with the emergence of new titles. That's not surprising. But so we don't ultimately, fundamentally, our kind of principal conclusions about employment don't depend upon us measuring new titles at all. They depend upon our measuring these innovations in useful ways.
Okay, I see. Yeah, then I guess we can conclude here. So
okay.
Thanks again, David. It's a very interesting talk. We learned a lot from you. So hope to see you soon in our future webinar. Maybe you can discuss more.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure talking with you. And I look forward to attending other seminars and seeing what the Institute kind of where it heads and what work it's doing ahead. So thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, David.
Great. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.